Our first speaker is Professor Elizabeth Brake from Arizona State University, although she is soon to be Professor of Philosophy at Rice University. She works on ethics and the political philosophy of marriage and the family. Her book is Minimizing Marriage, and she has also edited two collections, one called After Marriage and the other Philosophical Foundations of Children's and Family Law. Elizabeth, I don't have your title.
I'll read it.
You'll read it. Thank you.
There is a handout, so.
Oh, where is the handout?
I think the handout is on the chair.
Oh, okay.
Oh, hi. So the title is Constructing Conception, Gamete Donors and Voluntary Parenthood. And there is a handout so that you can kind of follow along the argument. So make sure that everybody gets a handout. Well, thank you very much. This is a great opportunity. So thank you, David, for organizing this. And I'm particularly personally grateful for the opportunity or the nudge to think about donor conception. So I've written a lot on parental rights and obligations and procreative ethics more generally. I haven't really written or thought much in detail about the ethics of donor conception. And so I think this conference is a great nudge for me and for other philosophers who haven't been paying as much attention to this important issue as we should be to think through it. So the first part of this paper, as you'll see from the handout, summarizes and applies my account of moral parenthood. That is my account of parental rights and obligations. And it applies my account of moral parenthood to gamete donation. So I'm not raising the question in this paper as to whether gamete donation, gamete conception is morally permissible. I'm assuming for the purposes of this paper that it is, although I think there are discussions we could have around that. My starting question is whether gamete donors are parents, and if so, what that entails. So the final part of the paper addresses some of the broader social concerns surrounding gamete donation. So I think there are broader social justice issues of many disparate kinds that we need to think about in shaping law and policy and regulation around gamete donation. And it might seem that the first part of the paper, which is a kind of principled philosophical moral analysis of parental obligations, is detached or kind of different in kind from the second part, which is looking at these broader social justice issues. But actually, the combination isn't happenstance. One implication of my moral account, my moral analysis of parental obligations as socially constructed role obligations is that we can shape social and legal frameworks for procreation, including donor conception and gamete donation. And we can shape those frameworks in a way that addresses broader social justice concerns. Okay, so part one, voluntary parenthood. So as I said, my starting question is whether gamete donors are parents. So to help us address this question, I'll begin with a series of distinctions. And I should say these distinctions, if you're interested in reading more about this, a starting point would be the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on procreation and parenthood, which I co-authored with Joseph Millam, who's at the NIH. And so you can find more about who holds these views in that site. So first of all, we must conceptually distinguish legal, biological, and moral parenthood. So a legal parent holds legal parental rights and obligations. But legal parents of a child, obviously, need not be its biological parents, as happens in adoption, in gamete donation, or contract pregnancy. Biological parenthood can be further distinguished into genetic derivation, direct genetic derivation, and gestational connections. Clearly, gamete donors can become biological parents, right? So that's not the interesting question. But typically, gamete donors are not legal parents. I'm interested in this talk in moral parenthood, which is a further and conceptually distinct sense of parenthood. So I think the really interesting question is not, are gamete donors legal or biological parents, but are they moral parents? So moral parenthood is possession of moral parental rights and obligations. And an account of moral parenthood is an account of the moral grounds of parental rights and obligations. So once we've made these distinctions between different types of parenthood, we can clarify the starting question. Does biological parenthood ground moral parental obligations? So by virtue of being a biological parent, as a gamete donor is, are you then a moral parent? Do you have moral parental rights and obligations? So a standard counterexample to the view that biological parenthood grounds moral parenthood is sperm donation. But I take it that that's just what is at issue here. Legal parenthood is also distinct from moral parenthood. So we can see that legal parenthood could be wrongly assigned from the moral point of view. And the urgent need for legal assignment of parenthood can draw legal and moral parenthood apart. So to determine whether gamete donors are moral parents, we need an account of moral parenthood. That is, an account of the moral grounds of parental rights and obligations. So why do parents have rights? Why do parents have obligations? So we can distinguish four influential accounts of moral parenthood. The causal account, the genetic account, the investment theory, and the intentional or voluntarist account. And hybrid accounts are also possible, but I'll set them aside. On the genetic account, moral parenthood is grounded in direct genetic derivation. On the causal account, moral parenthood is grounded in moral responsibility for causing the existence of a child. Right? And I'll spend some time focusing on that account and problems with it in this talk. On the investment or labor-based account, moral parenthood is grounded in the work put into creating a child, as in gestation. And so on the investment account, the biological father who merely inseminates the mother and doesn't do anything else has done much less work. And so his moral claim to parenthood would be correspondingly weaker. So finally, there's the intentional or voluntarist account, that the ground of moral parental rights and obligations is an intentional undertaking or voluntary acceptance. So you get parental rights and obligations because you accept them, you choose them. And this is the account that I defend. So I'm going to say a little bit about why I defend this account, and then I'm going to apply it to the concept, to the topic of donor conception. So taking each of these accounts in isolation, so again, setting aside possible hybrid varieties, it should be clear what each implies for gamete donors as moral parents. Right? If direct genetic derivation grounds moral parenthood, then gamete donors are moral parents. But genetic accounts are often criticized as lacking explanatory power. Right? They don't explain why genetic connection gives rise to these rights and obligations. And they seem to get the wrong answer. They seem to get counterintuitive results in cases of deception, such as a case of stolen sperm, right? So if sperm is stolen from a lab and a child is created, then it would seem to entail that the person who had donated the sperm in the first place is the moral parent. But this result seems counterintuitive. It seems like a reason to reject that account. Now, if investment, if the work put into creating a child grounds moral parenthood, then it seems egg donors might have more of a claim to moral parenthood than sperm donors, who again just seem to do much less work. But what kind of work towards the creation of a child counts. Right, so if we think about it, in assisted reproductive technologies, there are a lot of people contributing work. So does the work of the lab tech count? Does the work of the fertility expert count towards moral parental rights and obligations? So this kind of question, again, points to problems with the investment account of parenthood. And the causal account, so the account that moral parenthood is grounded in causal responsibility, again, suffers similar difficulties to the investment account in specifying the relevant notion of cause. Since, again, lab techs and doctors are arguably as causally responsible for the creation of a child as donors or as the intentional parents. So the intentional or voluntarist account, which I defend, most clearly implies that those who orchestrated the donation with the intention of becoming parents are the moral parents, and gamete donors are not moral parents. On my account, parental obligations are role obligations which parents assume voluntarily, right? And this view is pretty controversial in the ethics of procreation literature. I argue that voluntary acceptance of moral obligations is necessary for becoming a moral parent, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough to become a moral parent. At least two other conditions must obtain. Those taking on the obligations of parenthood must be able to carry them out, and the child must be eligible to be parented, right? So that implies no one else already holds moral parental rights and obligations. The voluntary account of parenthood rules out the accidental procreator as a moral parent, right? So just because they caused a child to exist through accidental procreation does not make them a moral parent. It also rules out the lab tech and the gamete donor. So I will briefly recap my argument for voluntarism before considering what it implies for gamete donation. So first a very brief overview, and then I'll go through the steps which are on your handout a little more slowly. So in sum, my view is that parental obligations are special obligations which arise from voluntary undertakings or acceptance. The alternative explanation of these special obligations, that they arise as a result of causal responsibility, right? That's the causal account, cannot account for the full extent of parental obligations. The relevant voluntary act is the acceptance of the parental role. Parental role obligations are defined by social and legal institutions of parenthood. Right, so one thing I'm saying is that parental obligations aren't somehow natural, they're socially constructed. Recognizing the constructed nature of parental roles allows us then to shape them legally and socially in light of moral or social justice goals. Okay, so to unpack this argument a little more, first, I'm assuming that parental obligations and not rights are fundamental to moral parenthood. Right, so I think really the fundamental aspect of moral parenthood is having moral parental obligations. I think that rights piggyback on obligations in the sense that parents have obligations, in the sense that parents have rights in order to carry out their obligations. So it's the obligations which are prior. So an account of moral parenthood must explain how moral parental obligations are incurred. And that's what I focus on. So second, I use this term special obligations. I said that parental obligations are special moral obligations. And by special obligations, I just mean obligations that are owed to particular specific other people. They're not general obligations. They're not obligations that we owe to the public at large, right, that we owe to everybody. They're obligations that we owe to specific other people as a result of some relationship with them. And obligations within the family, obligations of friendship, are paradigmatic cases of special obligations. So here's my general argument strategy. And again, this is complex, this is simplified and condensed, but this is the general argumentative strategy. So special obligations, obligations that we have to particular others, arise only through voluntary undertaking or as compensation for some harm. And this is a very controversial view, right? This is the voluntarist view. So secondly, parental obligations are special obligations. And I take that to be a non-controversial view, right? Parents have obligations only to particular children. So I don't think that view needs defense. Therefore, right, so if one is correct, which is, again, controversial, it follows from 1 and 2 that parental obligations are either the result of a voluntary undertaking or else they're owed as a compensation for some harm. Right? They're owed as a compensation for placing the child in a needy and vulnerable state. And I argue, this is premise 4, parental obligations are not compensatory obligations. I don't find that convincing. So therefore, parental obligations arise through a voluntary undertaking. So the voluntarist view that special obligations arise only through voluntary undertakings or as compensation is controversial, as I noted. The plausibility of voluntarism, to those who find it plausible, derives from the thought that obligations correlative to rights limit liberty. And liberty can only be limited as a result of choice or a result of wrongdoing. Now, of course, the path to parenthood may be unplanned, and a nuanced voluntarist account allows that parental obligations may issue from tacit voluntary acceptance rather than from a carefully planned and executed intention. Now, voluntarism is often criticized on the grounds that there are non-voluntary special obligations, such as duties of loyalty or gratitude. But here I would want to distinguish between duties of justice and duties of virtue. So I do think there can be involuntary or non-voluntary special obligations like gratitude, which are duties of virtue. They don't depend on choice, but they're not correlative to rights. So the kinds of special obligations that I think parental obligations are duties of justice. They're correlative to some right on the part of the child. The child has a claim against the parent. And it's those duties of justice that I think arise from a voluntary acceptance or as a matter of compensation. So the gist of my argument for 4, that parental obligations are not compensatory obligations, and this is an argument against the causal account, I think that this reflects an impoverished conception of parenting. The compensatory view seems to underlie the causal account of parenthood. According to the causal account, causing a child to exist if the agent acted freely and the effect was reasonably foreseeable entails moral responsibility for the child's existence. And this moral responsibility generates parental obligations. Right? So this seems to explain why we hold men who have sex with a woman and use contraception and then accidentally procreate, right, accidentally impregnate the woman. We hold them morally accountable. Why is that? They didn't intend to become moral fathers, right? The causal account seems to underlie holding them morally responsible, the fact that they caused this child to exist and therefore owe it something. Well, why? What's the explanation? What's the link between causing it to exist, causing the child to exist, and owing it something? And it seems to me in the literature, the explanation is that the procreator has placed the child in a vulnerable or needy state, right? A state to which the child could not consent to, right, by virtue of having been brought into existence by the act. And thus, the parent, the procreator, owes it compensation, right, or reparations to repair this needy state, to bring it out of the needy and vulnerable state. So The causal account, I said earlier, typically faces concerns about how to specify the relevant notion of cause, right? There are different kinds of causality, which is the relevant one for the causal account of moral parenthood. But I'm flagging a less noticed problem with the causal account. It has to explain how moral parental obligations follow from moral responsibility for the existence of a child, right? And if the explanation is compensation, then I think that that gives us an impoverished account of parental obligations, because I think there's a big gap between what we could reasonably say that procreators owe to repair a child's neediness and parental obligations. I think that parental obligations are much richer. So I refer to the compensatory obligations which procreators owe to those they procreate by virtue of having procreated as procreative costs. Right, so this will be important later in thinking through the policy around donor conception. So once again, by procreative costs, I mean something different from parental obligations, something conceptually different from conceptual obligations. I mean whatever it is that procreators, or those who bring a child into existence, those who are causally responsible for a child's existence, owe that child by virtue of having brought it into this needy, vulnerable state. I think that procreative costs are distinct from parental obligations. The reason is that parental obligations are, at least in the US today, are extraordinarily weighty in duration and scope. I think they go far beyond what we could reasonably think that procreative costs require. Procreative costs, it seems, repairing the child's neediness, could be discharged by providing food, shelter, health care, and then turning children out as soon as they can survive independently, as soon as they're no longer needy. But if we think about our parenting practices, they, as opposed to past societies or some other societies, they increase what parents owe and how long they owe it. Legally, parents are responsible for a much longer period than is required for mere independence, than would be required by procreative costs. They're required to ensure their children receive education, and they're prohibited from requiring that their children contribute financially. Socially, parents are expected to provide 18 years of support, warmth, affection, even love, and to enrich children's lives and enable them to flourish. These expectations, these rich expectations that we have for parental role obligations are all to the best, right? They're good for children, but they mean that parental obligations far exceed procreative costs. Okay, so I think that the variability of parental obligations that I just noted suggests that parenthood is a socially constructed role. And this is a further argument for voluntarism, because such socially constructed roles are typically assumed voluntarily. So part 2, constructed parenthood. The claim that parenthood is constructed is not supposed to be kind of a metaphysically rich or deep claim. It just means that the assignment and content of the parental role depend on social and legal conventions. And the relation between biological and social parenthood is malleable. So social parenthood is sometimes predicated on biological parenthood, but sometimes also on marriage and other kinship relations. So for example, what we know of prehistoric human societies suggests that they featured extended family groupings or polygamy, and hence group child rearing. Among historical societies, anthropological variation in family forms undermines the assumption that there's a single assignment of parental obligations natural to humans. So in husband-visitor societies, social and biological parenthood are not aligned. So in these societies, the man who impregnates a woman basically visits her. She lives with her male relatives, and those male relatives, like the child's uncle, would assume the parental role. In some matrilineal family structures, the child's maternal uncle, not his biological father, takes the male parental role. So social conventions determine who holds parental obligations, particularly in the case of men. Not only does the assignment of parenthood, who counts as a parent, depend on social and legal conventions, but the content of parental obligations depends on how societies divide up childcare. Who cares for a child and provides for it? What such care and provisions entail depend upon convention. So think about matters such as who feeds, clothes, and educates a child, at what age, for how long. Its care is regularly shared with others. Our society, as contrasted with other societies, considers children to become mature and self-supporting at a relatively late age. So for example, in Europe, prior to the 19th century, young men might be thought self-sufficient and young women marriageable as young as 13. Today, in our society, parents are responsible for their children until 18. Expectations of parental involvement and emotional intimacy also differ widely, as we're familiar with. So the constructed nature of the parental role raises problems for the causal account, and it makes the voluntarist role obligation account more plausible. So the variability that I've described suggests that law and society define the content of parental moral obligations through constructing a legal and social parental role which ensures assignment of child care responsibilities, right? It ensures someone takes care of these things, but the way different societies divide that up differs. And to be clear, I don't think that they can be assigned in just any way, morally. Law and society need to answer to moral considerations, so those morally constrain how the work of parenting can be divided up. Understanding parental obligations as role obligations, as a constructed social role, is a point in favor of voluntarism, because taking on role obligations typically issues from voluntary acceptance. Role obligations are not unique to parenthood. Doctors, lawyers, nurses, teachers, professors, and spouses take on socially defined and legally defined role obligations. But our experience of taking on role obligations typically involves acceptance and identification, right? So we identify with the role from the inside. So there's an element of intention that's involved in taking on a role. And that, I think, supports. So therefore, if we think of parental obligations as role obligations, it's a further reason in support of the intentional account of parenthood. Okay, so I'll cut the discussion of voluntary parenthood short to think about what does this imply for gamete donors? Are gamete donors moral parents? What did donors owe children created with their gametes? Right? That's why this question of moral parenthood is so important and interesting, because moral parenthood correlates, moral parental obligations correlates to rights on the part of the children. So those questions go together. Are gamete donors moral parents? And what do gamete donors, therefore, owe the children created with their gametes? So applying my own account to gamete donors surprised me. So unsurprisingly, on my account, gamete donors are not parents, as they do not intend to become parents or engage in the social conventions which trigger parenthood. So they're not moral parents. Unsurprisingly, they owe the resulting child a duty of easy rescue, as any stranger would, and I'll say more about that in a second. But the specific duties involved in a duty of easy rescue for a gamete donor are unique. What surprised me, though, was a further implication if we grant many assumptions of the causal account, the gamete donors owe what I called procreative costs. Okay, so let's go over the two unsurprising implications first. So first of all, it's clear on the voluntarist account that the donor who explicitly intends not to become a parent does not become a parent. He or she doesn't take on moral parental obligations. They don't intend to do so. We might worry about cases in which the donor says, oh, but secretly I intended to become a parent. And actually, this isn't just an outlandish case. There have been cases of informal sperm donation where the men have then later kind of reneged on their agreement and attempted to assert parental rights. Right, so we do need to ask, well, what about cases in which the person says, well, I didn't announce my intention, and in fact, I said that I didn't intend to become a person, but to become a parent, but secretly I had that intention, right? And so therefore, I gained moral parental obligations and therefore rights. But I think we can say in response to that kind of concern, there are certain social conventions about how we trigger the parental role obligations, right? And so that's why to become a parent, you don't need to explicitly say, I accept parental role obligations, right? Judith Jarvis Thompson famously gives the example, if you have a baby and take it home from the hospital, you're thereby triggering this parental role obligations. You're going through the social conventions which are involved in accepting the role. And so I think we can also use that point in the case of the person who has explicitly either contractually said or announced their intention to be a donor and not to become a moral parent. They haven't engaged in the social conventions that trigger the social role. In fact, they seem to have explicitly rejected them, right? And in that case, I think we can hold the person to the actions that they engaged in, which knowingly rejected the role, even if they claimed that they secretly had intended to take on the role. But where it becomes really more of a gray area is in cases where there aren't explicit intentions announced, right? And again, that speaks to the need for policy and regulation around gamete donation to help people clarify these intentions. Okay, so the second unsurprising implication of my account for donor conception is that gamete donors, like anyone, owe general duties of rescue to the resulting child, right? So by a general duty of rescue, I mean anyone who's in a position to save the life of a child or save a child from serious harm has a prima facie duty to do so, right? So to take Peter Singer's famous example, if you see a child drowning in a pond and you can pull it out with no threat to yourself, you want to do so. But what's interesting is that the duties that accrue to gamete donors under the duty of easy rescue are specific, right? They're unique to their position as gamete donors. So a gamete donor may be uniquely positioned to save a child or adult by sharing or disclosing genetic data, right? That can be life-saving or save someone from serious harm so that they know about their medical history. They know about their genetic propensities. Right, the voluntarist account does not exempt a gamete donor from the duty of easy rescue. Right? They don't have moral parental obligations, but they have the duty to rescue. So this is a moral reason for requiring access to the donor's medical and family history and genetic information. And the duty of easy rescue could require even more. So the duty of easy rescue, I think, can extend not just to saving lives, but to preventing serious harm. So for example, if we accept David Velleman's controversial thesis that biological or genetic connections, family history, is crucial to identity, so that not knowing them can result in harm, then the harm to a child of not knowing its parents' history could be great enough to require disclosure under a duty of easy rescue. Right? So I'm staying neutral on that thesis, but it would fall under the duty of easy rescue if that view is correct. Okay, so third, this is what really surprised me when I started to think through, well, how does my view apply to donor conception? If we accept that morally responsible procreators owe procreative costs, right? So people who intentionally engage in acts leading to the creation of a child, freely and knowingly doing so with the purpose of creating a child. If we accept that those people owe what I call procreative costs, right, which is just the compensation account, somehow compensating for the child's neediness, its vulnerability, making sure that it can survive to independence, essentially. It's difficult to see how gamete donors could avoid owing such compensation, right? And it seems to me that gamete donors would be much more morally responsible than the involuntary procreator who uses contraception and accidentally, nonetheless, procreates. So if it were consenting adults who were affected by the procreative act, of course, they could absolve the agent of liability in advance. But this is impossible in the case of procreation, since the person being affected does not yet exist, right? So there's no way to consent to being brought into existence. But the responsibility for the procreative costs, it seems to me, would extend not just to the gamete donors, but to the lab techs, to the fertility doctors, to whoever else was relevantly part of the causal chain. And again, I'm not sure how to specify the relevant notion of cause here, but it seems to me that everyone who's involved in knowingly, freely, intentionally creating this child would owe procreative costs if they're morally responsible for doing so. Now, procreative costs could be discharged by arranging adoption. But this suggests that everyone causally involved in creating the child who's morally responsible has a moral obligation to ensure that the commissioning parents are positioned to discharge the procreative costs, to raise the child to independence with a decent life. Now, while this could be done as simply as checking that the parents had been vetted by a reliable agency, right? So I think that the lab techs who are involved in this could discharge their obligations, just by ensuring that the parents, have been checked out, have been screened. This suggests a significant change in policy surrounding gamete donation. Right, prospective commissioning parents should be vetted in the way that adoptive parents currently are. And of course, this is jumping from the level of moral analysis to the level of law and policy. And we would need to say more about, well, how do you get from morality to the law? But so far as I know, and I'd like to hear more from medical professionals and lawyers who specialize in this area, so far as I know, commissioning parents who use donated gametes aren't screened in the way that adoptive or foster parents are, except in the case of donated embryos. And actually, that's a further interesting distinction, the distinction between donated sperm and donated eggs and donated embryos. But as far as I know, if there is a donated embryo, right, to adopt that, someone goes through the adoption screening that they would to adopt an existing child or an older child. In the case of donated egg or sperm, someone who goes to a fertility clinic and meets with a doctor and is able to pay is able to access that, right? So if that's correct, then what I'm suggesting is actually a significant change in policy. So in adoption, we more or less follow Hugh LaFollette's proposal to license parents in the way that we license drivers, by testing them for competence. So Hugh LaFollette argued that just because parenting poses serious risks to children, just like driving poses serious risks to pedestrians and other drivers, we should license parents by testing them for competence, just as we license drivers. In adoption, that's what we do. In the general case, it's hard to see how parents could be licensed without intolerable intervention into people's bodies, right? What are you going to do? Like force abortions or force people to take contraception? It's very hard to see how a general licensing strategy could be carried out. But in the case of gamete donation and other assisted reproductive technologies, right, since pregnancy hasn't already occurred, it seems at least more feasible, right? It seems to defeat that concern about a licensing strategy. Right, so why don't we require licensing for commissioning parents? Now, there are costs, and one cost is that such licensing will disproportionately burden LGBT people and single prospective parents, or prospective parents who don't have a sexual partner, or people with reproductive challenges. So that is a cost, but if we're thinking of the cost of those burdens against the cost of discharging procreative costs owed to the resulting child, right? We might think that the child's interests are more weighty. I mean, I think this is a difficult question. So rather than discussing this speculative but really quite significant licensing proposal with the depth and the detail that it deserves, I want to show how a number of broader social justice issues bear on policy surrounding gamete donation and the assumption of parenthood through the use of donor gametes. By drawing attention to the conventional nature of parental roles, the voluntarist account allows for critique of those roles on the grounds of justice. So from the standpoint of child welfare, for example, we can ask whether a given society's social and legal conventions of parenthood best protect children's interests. From the standpoint of equality, we can ask whether a given society's practices surrounding parenthood thwart gender justice or equality for gays and lesbians. Right, so the point that the grounds and content of parenthood are conventional is not morally relativist, right? So I'm not arguing for moral relativism about parenting. Rather, by exposing the conventionality of parenting practices, it opens them to moral analysis and social justice analysis and critique. So for one thing, pretty briefly, I want to go through a number of different important social justice concerns that I think are relevant to how we shape the parental role socially and legally. And I've spoken already about procreative costs, child welfare, what's owed to the child. Another concern is the allocation of parental responsibilities. Reallocating parental responsibilities, permitting a greater number of people than two to be parents, stands to benefit women and children, especially worse off women and children. When responsibility for children's needs falls primarily on two parents, it may overstrain caregivers, particularly working parents. Rethinking the parental role will allow us to decrease parental burdens by spreading those burdens among willing individuals. So for example, Bell Hooks has described what she calls revolutionary parenting that takes place among communities of working-class African-American women, a parenting model that resembles the extended family rather than the nuclear family. So as mentioned, the voluntarist account could allow gamete donors or other individuals to be considered third or fourth parents or quasi-parents. So especially in cases where the parties are previously known to each other, like in Canada's three-parent case, right, where there were two lesbians and then a sperm donor, where people already know each other in advance and consent to co-parent, recognizing three or more parents legally could actually benefit the parents and the children by spreading the burdens of parenthood among more people. And Melissa Murray, who's a law professor who's written on this topic, has also talked about the fact that with parenting, it's all or nothing, right? Either you have parental obligations or you're a legal stranger to the child. We could think about quasi-parents or some in-between legal status that allowed people who were not the primary parents to take on certain obligations and decision-making rights regarding a child. Another consideration in constructing donor conception and access to parenthood are the capacity of donor conception to oppose heteronormativity and amatonormativity. And so by that, I mean the special privileging of male-female relationships or the special privileging of romantic sexual relationships. Donor conception allows LGBT people to procreate. It allows people without sexual partners to do so, as well as people who are infertile. Not only does it offer gays and lesbians and single people access to the goods of parenting, its use can also gradually change the archetype of normal families to include single mothers by choice and same-sex parents. So I think these are reasons for ease of access to or financial support of ARTs, although they're in tension with the duty to discharge procreative costs, which I mentioned earlier. So another justice consideration is the different contributions of male and female gamete donors. Does the more onerous and dangerous work of egg donors entitle them to greater moral claims regarding the resulting child? Does gender justice require recognizing egg donors as quasi-parents? So how should we address gender justice in constructing donor conception? Another consideration is the connection between donor conception and race. So donors can be chosen explicitly on the basis of racial categories. Is this any different, you might ask, from choosing a spouse and likely, possibly, potential procreative partner with race as a background factor in attraction? So there's philosophical debate over the ethics of race-based dating or race-based partner selection. But in the case of donor selection, there's a significant difference. And I don't know any writing on this in philosophy. The person is choosing not a partner, not a sexual partner on the basis of race, but choosing what kind of person to create. So one question here is whether such choices are based on, whether they depend on stereotypes. Another question is whether patterns of choice could reinforce inequalities or stereotypes between racial groups or ethnic groups. And then a further question is, well, what could be done about that? If so, if it's a problem, how could that possibly be dealt with? Prohibiting the use of racial categories in donor selection seems, difficult in certain ways. So I think that's a difficult policy question. It is also complicated by the fact that in the United States, apparently, there's a shortage of donor sperm from certain racial minorities. So I think this is a very thorny question. And there's one final consideration that I'd like to touch on very briefly, and that's the issue of privacy. So I think with the rise of websites like Ancestry.com, we have seen the end of feasible anonymous gamete donation, even if anonymity were morally preferred, which I don't think it is. So I don't think it's morally preferred, but it also seems like it's not feasible due to Ancestry.com. How should practices of gamete donation and commissioning parents change, given that donors cannot reasonably expect anonymity anymore? Is there any right to privacy in this area? Should we think that donors waived their right to privacy due to the duty of easy rescue because resulting children might need genetic information? Should we be concerned about the privacy of the donor's future self or privacy of his or her extended family, right? So other people whose genes would be in this database. So I don't know what to say about that, but again, I think it's a concern we need to address. So answering these questions, I'm not pretending I can answer them. They would require significant empirical data, as well as insight from policymakers. My purpose here is first to flag this wide range of social concerns as relevant to constructing policy around donor conception. How we understand parenthood affects parents and children, but it also affects larger social expectations around sexuality, gender, race, class. My overarching point, the point that kind of unites both parts of this paper, is that understanding moral parenthood as issuing from voluntary role-based obligations allows us to reflect on how that role should be constructed in light of such concerns. So it allows us to ask whether a child might have more than two moral parents. It allows us to reflect on what policies and practices regarding parental obligations and the assignment of parenthood will best protect child welfare. Donor conception forces us to question things we or some people might previously have assumed to be natural and hence inevitable. The voluntarist account is compatible with recognizing the constructedness of the parental role and allows us to reflect on its definition in light of broader moral and social concerns. And that's all. Thank you.
Because the discussion is being live streamed and recorded, we'll ask you to speak into the microphone, and I'll hand the microphone to you, or Dan will. So, questions? Okay.
Okay, I won't announce my name for reasons of privacy.
Yeah, that's fine.
I guess. No, actually, I will, because I'm donor conceived. My name is Albert Franz. I've spoken out on this. I've given a TED Talk in California on the subject. I spoke recently at the United Nations. I spoke recently at the UN in Geneva on identity as a human right. And with all respect, Professor Brake, I followed your argument with very great interest. I will certainly review the video and take even more copious notes. I think what you're going to find now, I have a lot to say. I think there are some pretty significant holes in your argument, and believe me, there are things that you have not even begun to have to consider. And it's very notable that you're the first speaker today. I understand you're a philosopher, a philosophy professor. I also have a background in philosophy. I'm not a professional philosopher. I think you're going to find, rather than get into the nitty-gritty of your argument just yet, which it does have, I think, some merits in my opinion, but I think there are a lot of really, truly gaping holes. I don't think a person who is not donor conceived or adopted can even begin to ponder what it actually means and the true implications. Your whole argument talked all about the parents, it talked about social justice for different communities, including LGBTQ, including single mothers by choice. Personally, I don't oppose that at all. I believe very much in social justice for everybody, but your entire argument totally, utterly ignores the children and the adults that we become. You said nothing whatsoever except, well, children have needs, and the needs of a child, as Professor Velleman has written about, extend far beyond mere, they need food and shelter and they need to be sent to school. I have a lot of notes written down, so I don't even know which ones I don't want to.
Okay, frame the question.
Okay. I'll say one simple remark, if I could find it in my notes here. Okay, you said that, quote, if a donor, quote, explicitly intends not to become a parent, right, as is explicitly the case, then I think it's very clear that they should not, quote, donate. And we might also consider, let's throw it out there, you didn't talk about money in the role. There are tons and tons of issues, like whole very, very thick volumes to be written all about this subject, right? So I call that the donor misnomer. But I think if someone, quote, explicitly intends not to become a parent, then it's very clear they should not donate. And the only way to reject the parent role and any moral responsibility is not by donating in the first place. So I think I just ask you to reconsider certain things. I'd love to get a chance to talk with you one-on-one. And please listen to donor-conceived people. I think there's going to be a lot that you'll experience today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And I'm afraid I have to come back behind the podium to actually be recorded. Yeah, I really appreciate your perspective. And I think you're absolutely right. There are holes in my argument in the sense that this, as I said, I've written a lot on parental obligations, not in the case of donor conception. And so this is my first stab at thinking through some of these issues. And you're absolutely right. I don't have the empirical knowledge or the knowledge of what it's like to be donor conceived. And I think that perspective is very important. And I think that's a perspective that should contribute to framing policy around these areas. If I can just say a couple more things. So in response to your final question, so if someone, or your final point, if someone doesn't want to be a parent, they shouldn't donate. I'm confused as to whether you mean that gamete donation is then impermissible, right? Because if someone donates gametes, then they become a biological parent, right? Of course. They don't, under current law, become a legal parent. That could be changed, and I've suggested, there might be reasons to change it or have a quasi-parental status. That's something that I think just depends on a lot more than I can really provide in my analysis. A lot of empirical evidence, including experiences like that of donor-conceived individuals. But I do think that, so what I argued is that gamete donors don't become moral parents. They don't have moral obligations as parents. Now they do, what I said is they do have some obligations. They have the duty to easy rescue, and that would include opacity. That would include sharing their genetic history, even, if David Velleman's view is right, their family history, right? So it would require openness. And I went further to say it would even involve procreative costs. So when I talked about providing food and shelter and so forth, I was saying that is not an account of what it is to be a parent. Those procreative costs are impoverished as compared with parental obligations, which I think are much greater. So I was arguing that gamete donors actually have a responsibility or an obligation to make sure that someone is able to discharge those procreative costs and not to stand in the role of parent. But just what you've said already is kind of making me think about, again, questioning, that fundamental distinction that we make about, well, who is a parent and who isn't a parent. And I would like to hear more about your perspective. And just on money, I agree. There's so much that could be said about the fertility industry and exploitation and class and access to ARTs. And I meant to gesture at that in the social justice issues, but I absolutely agree that that's a huge issue. Yeah, so.
No, we need to give people a chance to.
Hi, my name's Kelsey. I'm speaking as a non-donor conceived individual, so with great respect for everyone in this audience who might be. The one thing that I wanted to ask you about, in the section where you were talking about things that surprised you, you spoke about the potential for basically vetting prospective parents. What I wanted to know, and I'm not extremely educated on this, so perhaps you have the information, are gamete donors vetted as well? And should they be? Because that really stood out to me as a question, especially when it comes to people now learning of parentage through things like Ancestry.com, that sort of thing. Are they vetted to that degree, and should they be? Mm-hmm. What's your thought on that? Thank you.
So again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a medical professional. My understanding is that gamete donors are vetted a certain amount, but they're not vetted to the amount that a prospective adoptive or foster parent would be, because that would include things like in-depth psychological interviews, home visits. I do not think that gamete donors are vetted to that amount. And that Okay, so that raises some really thorny issues because then we get into worries about eugenics, right? So first of all, if we're vetting gamete donors, so we might want to say, well, we should vet gamete donors to ensure that the resulting child is able to have a minimally decent life. I mean, that's going to get into some really difficult issues then when we think about disability theory, right? And so who determines what's a minimally decent life? What kinds of genetics or what kinds of genes are good genes and bad genes? So if we're thinking about screening them in that way, for their genetic history, it seems like it would involve very problematic, or it could involve very problematic kinds of policies. But there could be vetting for such as psychological interviews. And that actually might be something very appropriate. Again, thinking about people who then in later life, so when donor-conceived individuals get into contact with gamete donors, will that gamete donor be kind of like psychologically equipped to be in relationship
that was more
with them?
the nature of my question, yeah.
And
Thank you.
that sounds like a very good suggestion.
Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm donor conceived. There are like over 40 of us in here, so you have like a tough crowd. I just wanted to mention, you talked a lot about talking to other policymakers, like lawmakers and people in the medical fields, but there are a lot of, beyond people who are donor conceived, there's going to be a lot of people to talk to when it comes to the emotional welfare of the child. I mean, it goes beyond that when it comes to like being vetted. It has more to do also with like medical history. I mean, there's a lot that a parent morally has to do. And I think with morals, it goes beyond, just like what responsibilities they have. It also has to do with like the emotional welfare of the kid. So I'm just curious, like when it comes to that, I think a lot of that was overlooked. Like there's a huge gap in that in general. So I was just curious, like what you think about how it affects that third party, because there's a lot of talk about parenting and about like oh well, we really just wanted to conceive, and whether we're a lesbian couple or heterosexual, and I think it's more like, well, how does it affect the welfare of the kid, and if it's morally like a parent's responsibility to talk about to take care of the kid and their psychological welfare. I mean, like in countries like Australia, where anonymity is just like it's not there anymore when it comes to this type of thing. I think there's a reason for that. So I'm just curious, like about where that fits in.
Right, good, excellent. Yeah, so I do think those are parental obligations. I think that's an excellent example of a parental role obligation, is caring for the child's psychological and emotional welfare. And I think what I'm getting from you is, in the case of in the case of donor-conceived individuals, there are going to be special emotional and psychological needs that other individuals might not have. Am I getting that wrong? I'm getting, yeah, do you want, yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, do you feel that there should be a moral limit on how many they're allowed to create? Also, what about birth certificates? You talk about parentage. Shouldn't the donor or medically assisted child that's conceived, shouldn't their medical, like, birth certificates, shouldn't those be updated? Shouldn't there be a notation on it? I mean, what about, another thing is, don't parents have an obligation to tell their children the truth?
Okay. Yeah.
I found out at 38 years old that I am donor conceived. My whole life has been a lie. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, good. Good. So as I was saying to Zoe, I agree. There are parental obligations to take care of children's psychological and emotional welfare, so far as that's possible, so far as the parents are able to do so. And so what I'm getting from your responses is they're distinctive psychological and emotional needs in the case of donor-conceived individuals. And those distinctive needs might include like frank and honest discussions from an early age about their origins in donor conception. And so I think if that's something that is, you know, if that's something that's required for the child's psychological well-being, and I'm not a psychologist, and I think this is really where people, you know, like me who are working in this area need to hear from you, and this is why your testimony is so important. But I think if that is the case, that knowledge, that discussion is important for the child's emotional and psychological well-being, and I can see how it would be, right? The thought that you've lived your whole life is a lie, or without knowing something very important about yourself, I can see that would be something that's disturbing. And so if that's the case, then I think that does fall under parental obligations. So I think, you know, what's very interesting is the thought of, you know, the need for kind of ethical, right? So not just kind of like best practices, but even a strong ethical code surrounding, well, how should donor-conceived individuals be told and talked to about their origins? And then the case of the birth certificate, I really don't know about that issue, but in the case of numbers, I think is really interesting, because I had to leave this out for reasons of time, but I was also thinking, you know, with egg donors, I mean, the upper limit of how many eggs can be donated is going to be much lower than with sperm donors.
I also,
And
you mentioned a lot between like sperm donation and egg donation.
yeah.
I think when it comes from the viewpoint of like the third party, it has like, I think they're quite equal when it comes to like about the ethics, you know, like about how the third party reacts to it. I don't think you can like you can't just divide them. I think like they're both, like in a general sense, when you're trying to conceive, you either use a sperm donor or an egg donor.
Right, so who's the third party? Is the third party the donor-conceived individual?
Sorry?
Is the third party the donor-conceived individual
Yes.
that you're talking
That's
about?
That's
Yeah,
what
so
I'm
you're saying
referring
that
to.
from that point of view, the egg versus the sperm donor.
Yeah, I don't think that impacts the parental, like their morality, like what they
Right.
need to do.
Yeah, good, except for the thought that you suggested that there might be psychological effects to knowing that there are 70 other siblings conceived. Is that what you were? Oh, that's very low, right? And so that's that worry, that particular psychological worry.
Do you think that's an acceptable amount of people, amount of donations?
So that arises with sperm donors.
Sorry,
Yeah. So I think, so I have no prior views about the acceptable amount of donation, but I see your point that the knowledge of a number of genetic siblings that you're unaware of, the number of those unknown siblings is going to have a psychological effect. And again, I think that effect is something that's going to be relevant in framing the policy. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. My name is Dr. Nancy Freeman Carroll, and I want to raise just another ethical issue that you brought up, which was your question about when you were talking about the potential evaluation of recipient parents, which does happen, as well as thorough evaluations of donors, although that has evolved over the past, 40, 50 years. I'm most concerned with your question about raising this idea, should parents be evaluated the way that adoptive parents are, and you also used the term adoption in referring to embryo donation.
Right.
And the problem is that gametes are not people.
Yes.
And so if we begin to go down that path, then we're in the realm of calling a gamete a person, which I think serves other political and ethical issues. And so I think there's a good reason to keep those two things very separate.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, with your first point, so my understanding, and this is based on talking to fertility doctors and prospective parents in Arizona, where I live, is that the vetting that's involved in ARTs is very much less than the vetting that's involved in adoption.
It is different.
Right, it is different. And so, yeah, as far as the embryo adoption point goes, I was trying to stay neutral on that issue. But yeah, what I was saying at the end is, I think it's interesting to think about, when we're thinking about gamete donations, what are the differences, the ethical differences between egg donation, sperm donation, and embryo donation, right? And I understand the use of the term embryo adoption is contentious for the reason that you mentioned. Yeah, I agree.
I'd like to raise a slightly different question. I think behind some of the dispute is the asymmetry between rights and obligations on the part of parents and children, which is a general problem. Children often exaggerate their ability to impose obligations on parents for things that would be very desirable. So if parents are getting divorced and abandoning a child, the child would naturally wish to have a say and veto that divorce for its own benefit. I think that's similar to a lot of the issues with the gamete donors. The obligation to provide genetic information, for example, which is a benefit to the future health decisions being made by the donor child. How far do you want to push that? Suppose the donor child needs a kidney. The gamete donor would be a good person to provide one of those kidneys. We surely wouldn't want to say that he has an obligation or any more obligation than he would have to any of his other children. It would be very nice to do it, but we would never want to obligate him to give that kidney. So there are limits. What the child would wish from the parent does not necessarily obligate the parent in the way that the type of obligations you've described do.
Yeah, so I think what's needed for the child's well-being, I mean, we need to also think about, what kind of burden is that placing on the parent. Now, in the case of divorce, requiring a couple who are very unhappy or high conflict to stay together when they don't want to is a significant burden, right? It's a significant interference, with their freedom, potentially with their well-being. Similarly, requiring someone to donate a kidney to someone else is a significant physical burden. But in the case of requiring donors to make their information available, I mean, that's sharing knowledge. And I didn't claim that the donor should be, willing to give up a kidney, or that the donor should even be, willing to engage in a relationship. But that I thought there is, under the duty of easy rescue, reason for the donor to make their information available. And making that information available, it seems to me, is something that's much less onerous than giving up a kidney or continuing in an unhappy marriage. And so it seems like something that would, where the child's welfare, depending, if it is important to the child's welfare, would be able to override whatever right to privacy the donor has, if there is a right to privacy in this area in the first place, which seems to me a different question.
Hi. Oops, I dropped my phone. My name is Katie. I had a question. It was at the very beginning of your talk. You started distinguishing the different types of parenthood. And you said, correct me if I'm wrong, you said something like natural parenthood, where two people just have a baby, is harder to explain.
So I was trying to avoid the use of the term natural, because part of my point is, like, parenthood is something that's socially constructed.
Okay.
So I might have said biological parenthood, or I might have slipped up and said natural parenthood too. But
Yeah, so I was just curious because there are a lot of factors that go into that obviously you were limited on time focusing on donor conception. But what about the studies where, or just the fact that when most babies are born, they look like the father, so that the father knows that it's his child, and the statistics about children being raised in homes by a man they're not related to, suffering more violence. It seems like there's a lot of support for intact biological parentage that is out there, and it's not just simply a social construction of who's taking care of the child.
Right. Right, so the thought is that there's a relationship between biological parenthood and being a good parent. Yeah, I would be interested to look at that empirical evidence. I mean, I think we also know that biological parents can be bad parents as well. So I think when we're thinking, that seems to me the kind of consideration that's relevant in thinking about, well, how do we construct the parental role and who is a parent? And certainly I think there are going to be cases where an adoptive parent is going to be able to be a better parent than the person who's the biological parent of the child. So, I mean, depending on how extensive, how overwhelming the empirical evidence is, I think it would play a greater or lesser role in shaping policy. But it doesn't seem to me like there's a general, that it's always true that the biological parent is going to be the best parent. And I mean, the other thing is in my work, I tend to think about how people actually live. Right, so we might have a kind of idealized family, that the law reflects with like two biological parents who are married to one another in a monogamous marriage. A lot of people, there are step families, there are blended families, there are donor-conceived individuals. A lot of people aren't living in those situations. So I think that the law needs to address, and policy needs to address, like the situations in which people actually live. And I mean, you might respond, well, there are ways that we could like incentivize biological parents. I think you use the phrase biological intact families, but then that can also have costs as well. So that's a good question.
Hi, my name is Zave. I just want to thank you for speaking today. I did find your talk really fascinating. And I was especially drawn to what you're talking about easy rescue and the moral obligation there to do what is necessary for the health of that child, that adult. And for me, I feel like I have suffered irreversible harm being commodified, being a result of eugenics, not knowing if I have had incest. There are pedophiles who use this technology to create infant sex slaves. I am of the opinion that, or using easy rescue, then wouldn't you say that if there's going to be irreversible harm, that maybe both the biological and the gamete parent have a moral obligation to not use this technology, given the harm will be irreversible if it occurs?
Right. Well, some of the harms, child sexual abuse, I mean, some of those harms are common to, procreation without donor conception, as well as procreation with donor conception. So there's sort of general problems, and they're not intrinsic to donor conception. But if there are irreversible harms to a child that are necessarily part of donor conception, that would seem like a strong moral reason against it. But the question is, one way we can think about it is whether these harms attend to all donor-conceived individuals and whether they're so great that they make the child's life not worth living, right? So on balance, right, would the child be glad that they were brought into existence? But yeah, I mean, I think I would want to know more about the prevalence of this type of psychological harm, of feeling commodified, and the severity of it. But certainly those are, I think those are really, I said at the outset, just for reasons of time, I'm not going to go into the question about the permissibility of procreation. But certainly many people have argued, not just with donor conception, but in general, procreation is impermissible, right? It's a view called antinatalism. We shouldn't bring people into being not just through donor conception, but through any type of procreation because, to paraphrase David Benatar, right? It's better never to have been. It's better never to have existed. So I'm skeptical that the harms of being a donor-conceived individual are so great that it would be better. But as has been pointed out, I do not know, enough about those harms and what it's like.
Hi. Okay, so for the record, it's the FDA that is the only legal regulation that we have in the country on donated gametes, and they are treated as under Section 1271 as human cell and tissue-based products. And so currently the only regulation that we have or vetting that's legally required is sexually transmitted diseases and hereditary diseases. There is no legal limit on how many donor-conceived individuals or how many families using the same donor are used. These are all kind of under the discretion of the bank. And I think the only law is that they have to be labeled the right way. And these are like relatively recent laws. I mean, I know there are a lot of people in this room who that's not exactly the case for. Do you agree that this is something where it's ethically okay that this is only treated as a tissue-based product? I mean, I know that bringing a donated embryo is, I know it walks the line a little bit on like the ethical issues there, but when it's intended with the sole purpose of creating a human, where it's not just the kind of embryo, but it is the embryo with the intention of basically raising that to be a child, where would you say we can legally change that?
Right. Yes, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the legal classification of the tissue. But, I mean, so what I was arguing is I think that people who are causally involved in the creation of children, who are by their nature, human children are needy and vulnerable and need care, that the people who are intentionally and freely involved in that process, including gamete donors, are morally responsible for what I call the procreative costs. And so it seems to me like just being able to buy, I mean, if what you're saying is accurate, just being able to buy, sperm or eggs as tissue without some further vetting of the commissioning parents is inadequate. That there needs to be further vetting to ensure that the children, and of course there are epistemic limits, right? There are limits on how much we can know and predict who's going to be a bad parent and who's going to be a good parent. And that's just an imperfection, a practical problem. But so far as possible, I think that those who are involved do have a moral obligation to ensure or to at least have reasonable grounds to believe that the commissioning parents will be able to at least discharge the procreative costs. And then you might want to say the commissioning parents should actually be required to do a lot more to be good parents. And I think that's, that's an interesting position. But at the very least, I think it's clear that there should be vetting to ensure that the procreative costs can be discharged, that the parents will raise the child with a minimally decent life to independence. And so I think you're also talking about the vetting of the donors and what else should be involved in their vetting. And just to go back to something that was said earlier, I do think it's given the kinds of psychological and emotional effects on the child, perhaps psychological vetting of the donors would also be appropriate because of the potential future relationship. So I think that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Put that on the FDA or?
Probably not. No, probably not, no.
Hi, I'm Allie. I just found out in January that I'm donor conceived, so this is very green to me. Thank you for talking about this. I think that we are chronically unheard, and just the entire idea of donor conception in and of itself, when I started Googling, was like nowhere to be found. So thank you. You talked about rights and obligations. I do think that it's an obligation of a gamete donor to provide any offspring with medical history family history even. But then that scares me as a person, that would I then have to afford that donor rights? I think about who my parents are, and I love them very dearly. And I would never want to have to afford a donor rights that I give to my parents to be my parents. You said that rights piggyback on obligations, but that obligations come first. So I'm just wondering, can we exist in a society where a donor is obligated, but then I don't owe them anything in return?
Good. So I think you don't owe them anything in return. So I was saying parental rights piggyback on parental obligations. But I wasn't saying the donor is a moral parent, but I think the donor, under the duty of easy rescue, owes the medical history, maybe the family history. So those aren't parental obligations, and so the parental rights don't piggyback on them. Yeah, but and when I was talking about, well, could donors be third or fourth parents or quasi-parents? I mean, in that case, I was thinking about cases where the donors and the commissioning parents are known to each other and agree to co-parent, from before conception, right? So, and that's a different kind of family formation where the donors would actually occupy the parental role and maybe not just be donors anymore. Yeah.
One more question, and then we're out of time.
I work in a fertility center as a mental health professional, and I also have a donor-conceived child. So maybe I can talk about this from two different directions. But I just want to say that in the more reputable fertility centers, the intended parents who are coming in to use donor gametes are counseled and seen and counseled to tell early. I wouldn't say that they're exactly evaluated as parents, but certainly in terms of how they think about the role of having a child through donor conception. The donors are also, they are evaluated, and their information, including medical history, going back 3 generations, including genetic history, including what we know at the time that they donate, is all given to the intended parents so that they can share that information with the children. And again, we are telling people now in the fertility centers, the donors are findable. So if you think, so we're telling this to the donors and to the intended parents, the donors are findable. If you think that you don't want to be found, don't donate. But again, the role of being found is different than necessarily as a parent, but more as a known donor at some point. And so there's a lot of discussion about that, but it's not as if the fertility centers aren't trying to work on all of these ethics and talk to both the intended parents and the donors about their roles and about the impact on the children who come first in our minds.
Yeah, and that seems like a good thing, but the concern that I have is if right now fertility centers are kind of like a Wild West, where the more reputable, the better fertility centers are doing this, but there are others that are not. And that's where I think the role of policy and regulation comes in, so that all fertility centers, can be using these higher standards. But yeah, and I don't want to diminish or generalize the good work that people are doing, for child welfare in fertility centers, but rather to flag the problem that not, that needs to be something that there's policy and regulation for.
Thank you.